but we do a lecture every month from someone who lives on Capitol Hill and who has a specialty that we think the community would like to hear about. Tonight we have a lot of people signed up, and so we're going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to ask you if you have a question for Connie at the end of the program to either write it in the chat or use the raised hand function so we can get you organized in asking questions. But we have more than 40 people signed up, and we really can't just do the looking around and seeing who's waving hands. So we'll try it and see how this goes. Thanks to Maygene Daniels, as always, for the promotion that she does for this event. Thanks to Judy Berman and to Mary Bloodworth, who's managing our Zoom tonight from Capitol Hill Village. We are recording this session with Connie's permission, and it will be posted on the village website in the future. So remember, as you're thinking of asking a question, that we really are recording this. If you want to ask a question, then do remember to type in chat, but have yourself muted, please. So anyone who's on who isn't muted now, except Connie, please do mute yourself. Okay. In December 2019, we were privileged to hear from Dr. Constance Citro on the prospects for the upcoming 2020 census and a little history of the US Census. At that time, none of us could have imagined what was going to happen and the problems that the 2020 census was going to have in a year of COVID. So we've asked Connie back, and she's very graciously agreed to look now at the 2020 census and try to help us understand what happened and where we go from here. Connie is the senior scholar at the Committee on National Statistics. She previously served as director of that committee for more than a dozen years. She's a fellow of the American Statistical Association, although her PhD is actually in political science, not statistics. She's an elected member of the International Statistical Institute. She's received numerous awards, including the Award for Innovation in Federal Statistics and her work on the 200 and 2010 census. And she is one of the 3 honorees of an annual award in her name, given by the American Statistical Association, called the Links Lecture Award. So she's a very distinguished member of our community, and she is the country's leading expert on the US Census, and we're privileged to have her with us. The Zoom room is yours, Connie.
Thank you so very much. I'm now going to endeavor to do the always fraught thing about sharing my screen. Is it up? It looks like it is. And I'm now going to hope to get this into slideshow from the beginning so that you see the full thing here. And I'm just delighted and honored to be asked back again to talk about the 2020 census. Before I go further, I want to give a shout out to the dedicated Census Bureau employees who soldiered on through all kinds of problems to conduct this census. The country is really in their debt. Okay, what am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to remind us why the census matters. I'm going to do a little bit of history, a little different from what I did the last time, that focuses on census and political power in this country. I'm going to talk about 2020, which hit a perfect storm, which is still blowing, perhaps not quite gale force, but we still have winds blowing and issues ahead. Now, the apportionment counts for the 50 states were released on April 26th of this year, and that is 4 months later than they would ordinarily have been released in a typical census year. In fact, by law, they're supposed to be released by the end of December. Redistricting data we expect out in mid to late August, and they are also about 4 months late. These will have not just population, but age, race, sex, ethnicity, and all the geographies, states, counties, places, neighborhoods, city blocks. How good are the data? Well, we don't actually know much yet about that. I'll share with you what we do know and what problems lie ahead. I'm going to put two on the table. I think redistricting is going to be more chaotic than usual. And this is partly because of the delayed schedule, but it also intertwines with a new method for protecting privacy the Census Bureau is using. It's called differential privacy. It's from the computer science world. This is a laudable goal. Census guarantees confidentiality, but this particular method has got some hiccups. Okay, but first, I thought you might just want to see who gained and who lost seats. The purple are states that lost a seat, mostly Middle Atlantic, Midwest, also California. The gray, no change from 2010, and the green, light green, gained a seat. Texas gained 2. We hit 331,449,281. This was the second lowest growth rate in our history, the lowest being only 7.3% in the 1930s Great Depression. The state that is probably the most anguished about the outcome is New York. If 89 more people had been counted, New York would have held on to its 27th seat. Instead, Minnesota held on to its 8th seat by just 26 people. So on such a small margin does political power rest when you're talking about the last seat. Here's DC. This is 1920 to 2020. And our population in 2020 got up to 689,545. If you look back historically, biggest growth rates were in the 30s when people flocked to work for the government in the New Deal, and then World War II. Then we plateaued, we went down, we then started back up in 2000. The number we achieved was actually lower than what some projections had been, but it is still a very robust, almost 15% growth, double what the US as a whole. Okay, remind ourselves of why the census matters. Well, censuses in the old days were for the autocratic governments to count people for taxation and military service. Goes back to ancient Egypt. The British conducted censuses in many of the American colonies. We were the first with a constitutionally mandated census to let us peaceably reapportion power as our population grew and spread out. So the census, how many seats in the House, state legislatures, city councils, I also use census data, the Electoral College, and something called direct taxes, which is instead of asking you and me to fill out our 1040 individually, the federal government might say, Massachusetts, you owe the federal government X amount. Now, actually, this has never been used, but it sits there in the Constitution. The census also gives us a sense of where we are, where we've been, where we may be going. We grew from just under 4 million people in 1790 to our 331 million, and we're actually the third most populated country in the world. Now, China and India are orders of magnitude larger, but still, there we are. Demographically, we went from 16% people of color, mostly African-American slaves, to 40% people of color of a wide variety of ethnicities and races. We went from overwhelmingly rural to overwhelmingly urban, and the foreign-born percentage has gone up and down as we have blown hot and cold on how welcoming we are to immigration. This is a use that you may not be so aware of. I sum it up as stats. The census is updated actually every year by the Census Bureau with population estimates for states, counties, places. They take the census, they add birth and death records and so on. And these estimates are very important. They benchmark flagship statistics from surveys. When you see the monthly unemployment rate, the annual poverty rate, these post-census estimates have been used to make the census, to make the surveys more representative of the entire population. The post-census estimates are also used as denominators. Think of mortality rates for COVID versus the flu, or crime rates. They are also components of many allocation formulas. Billions of dollars flow out from the feds to states and localities, Medicaid, Title I education, highways, and these post-census estimates are often part of that. Users, because of the extraordinary circumstances, adverse circumstances for 2020, have been worried whether 2020 census is good enough for these purposes. I wanted just to throw this in because it's kind of interesting. The census is itself a little mini engine of economic innovation. Actually, each census year, the employment numbers boost up because census has to hire hundreds of thousands of people to go out in the field for folks who don't self-respond. And because it is so large and so complex and has to be done in a pretty limited time period, it's been a real spur for innovation. Herman Hollerith in 1890 invented punch card technology that was used for census processing, and he later helped found IBM. Probability sampling, which was very new in the US and the world, came in the 1930s basically, was used in the 1940 census for a few items. The first commercial computer, UNIVAC 1, was used to process some of the data from the 1950 census. And I believe this computer, which was gigantic, in size, is now in the Smithsonian. In 1980, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but methods that wildlife biologists use to estimate things like how many fish are in the lake when you actually can't easily count them all were adapted to measure undercount in the census and overcount. No matter how good a census, because our population is so big and diverse, there are always some people missed and some people double counted. 2020, the census used the internet for self-response. I imagine many, if not most of you, use that method, and it was one of the bright spots in 2020. Okay, just a brief review of how intertwined the census is with political power in our country. Article 1, Section 2, that's the Census Clause. Who counts? From the beginning, everyone counted, all persons except foreign tourists. And in the beginning, Indians not taxed. They had, they had treaties with us. They were not counted, and slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. The 14th Amendment in 1868 made former slaves US citizens and explicitly repealed the 3/5 clause. American Indians were made citizens in 1924. And so then they were counted in the census, whereas before, if they were on tribal reservations or they were just roaming free out in frontier lands, which had basically disappeared by then, they had not been counted. Now, since 1980, there have been court cases brought to force the Census Bureau to determine the number of undocumented immigrants and exclude them from the state counts for reapportionment. This would be very difficult to do, and it would totally tank response for all immigrants, I think, and it's always failed in court to date. But there have been that kind of effort as immigration went on an upward path from its nadir in around 1970. Okay, apportionment. The Constitution laid out the number of seats per state, but they took a census right away. It was one of the first things the new government did. And every decade, Congress used to pass the census apportionment law. And I want you to visualize smoke-filled rooms. I'm talking cigars and pipes and who knows what, hot air in the Capitol. And there were disputes on the method because we don't have fractional Congress people. So you have to figure out what to do with the last seats, which if you had fractional people, that would work out, but we don't. So one safety valve that was available prior to the Civil War, and indeed for the 19th century, was to expand the size of the House, not only as new states came in, but as states lost population relatively, but you could leave them having the same number of seats and they would feel a little better than if they actually lost seats. And so in a number of censuses, Congress did increase the size of the House, but it didn't always do this. And the South in particular saw the handwriting on the wall, and this was one of the many factors that the South decided to rebel at this point in time in 1860. Okay, keep visualizing more smoke-filled rooms and hot air in the Capitol after the Civil War. In these decades, generally the size of the House, well, it was always increased and very few states lost seats. We get to 435 in 1910, and that's what we have right now because law was passed that we are not increasing the size of the House. Okay, 1920. This is the closest analog to what happened in 2020. We were just out of World War I, the flu pandemic. There was a spike in violence, riots, lynchings, labor strikes, real fears of revolution. In this graph, you can see peaks for riots and lynchings around 1860, and then in 1920. The 60s civil rights era, then you see terrorism starting to go up. This graph stops at about 2010. I'd love to see it continue to the present. But the point was, this was a very fraught period in our history. And the 1920 census, they decided to take it in January, not clear quite why. They ran into winter weather, the aftermath of the pandemic, and trouble hiring. They actually had to raise wage rates, and it took 5 months. And nobody liked the results. People thought there had been an undercount, even though, of course, we had just come out of a world war and a pandemic. But more important, rural America really didn't like the fact that the census showed an urban majority for the first time and lots of immigrants. So for the first and so far only time in our history, Congress did not reapportion the House. They were also fighting about the method, which had never been fully settled. They did pass in 1924 a law that drastically restricted immigration. Finally, in 1929, they passed a law providing for automatic reapportionment. The Census Bureau takes the count. A staff that's kind of locked away runs the formula, which Congress has set, hands the state numbers to the president, who is supposed to be a pass-through to the clerk of the House, to the states, and it's all supposed to happen the last week in December, first week in January, when Congress is not in session, and so minimize fuss. We've had that system ever since, instead of individual apportionment laws each decade. But how did rural America be convinced to sign on to this? The trade-off is that Congress turned a blind eye to malapportionment within states. Previously, Congress used to tell the states each time they gave them their allocation, make your districts compact, contiguous, equal population. They dropped all that language. And a lot of states overrepresented their rural population vis-a-vis their urban population. In 1930s, the largest New York State district had 800,000 people and the smallest had 90,000 people. This was finally redressed in the 1960s, one person, one vote court cases, and also the Voting Rights Act. Okay, so that's the system that we have had. And this map shows the overall change from 1970 to 2020 in House seats. The darkest red is New York, which has lost 13 seats over this period. Then you get a sort of rusty red and then a brown, and that's losing fewer and fewer seats. The very lightest green are states that had no change from 1970 to 2020. Then as the green deepens, those are the states gaining more. Texas gained 14 seats over the period and Florida 13. So you can see the movement of our population. Okay, let's go to 2020. Well, for me, the perfect storm begins back when the previous administration decided that it was going to add a question on citizenship. Now, citizenship is on a lot of surveys, but it has not been on the census in decades. And the purpose, it came out later, not at the time, was the previous administration wanted the citizenship question for use in redistricting to make the gerrymandering, which goes on for partisan advantage, even more extreme for that administration's party. Lawsuits were filed immediately, consolidated in California, Maryland, New York. Trials began. Late June 2019, the Supreme Court said, well, it's not actually illegal to add a question, but you haven't given a very good justification and you haven't followed the process and you need to go back to the drawing board. Well, the previous administration decided that they would not go back to the drawing board. Instead, they ordered the Census Bureau to develop estimates of citizen voting age population using Social Security data, Homeland Security data, et cetera, to be available with the redistricting data. Okay, 2020, the peak of the storm. Now, the census in modern decades actually begins in January in remote Alaska, because the idea is everything's frozen over and planes can land and so on. And that actually happened in 2020 on schedule. Self-response also started on schedule. And you all may remember getting, your letters and postcards in the mail, responding and giving you an internet access code and so on. But at the same time self-response started, the country shut down, and in particular, college students fled or were sent home, shipped home. College towns like Ames, Iowa, or Ithaca, New York, or many others, the way the census residence rules work, college students are supposed to be counted there. And so this is a real problem to have them all disappear back home for these communities. Now, there are a lot of processes that go on to supplement the self-response, and I have simplified here. The major field operation is non-response follow-up, or NRFU, where they send interviewers out to knock on doors if you didn't self-respond. Ordinarily, they give about 6 weeks for self-response, and then they would start NRFU in middle of May. Well, they couldn't do it. They planned to start it in mid to late August, hoping that COVID was sort of under control then, which of course it wasn't. Meanwhile, the administration has all of a sudden realized that the Census Bureau has asked for more time for the field work, for the editing they have to do, and that they wouldn't be releasing the apportionment data on the usual schedule. So they ordered the Census Bureau to speed up everything and give them the apportionment data and give them estimates of undocumented immigrants. That generated a whole mess of lawsuits. Meanwhile, hurricanes, wildfires in various states. So this was really a heavy lift, and it was about 35% of the population that had to be followed up in the field. And the lawsuits, they went back and forth, and one judge would say, no, the Census Bureau should take as long as it originally projected. And another lawsuit would say, no, they need to stop. Anyway, they finally stopped October 15th, about 2 weeks ahead of when they had planned they would stop. It always takes several months to process the data. There are duplicate responses. maybe somebody responded on their laptop at home, and somebody, given the advertising, you can answer on your smartphone, maybe you're in the metro, and so there could be duplicates. They have a method to handle that pretty accurately, but they had a lot more duplicates than they usually do. Plus, they had these problems with college students and with people in prisons, nursing homes, homeless shelters, RV vans, all these special situations. So they were signaling in the late fall that they couldn't make the administration's deadline of saying we want this stuff by the end of December, or certainly by, early January. They just said they could not do that. And we dodged a bullet, in my opinion. I don't know whether the previous president would have meddled with the apportionment counts, but it was certainly not beyond him, and it would have been a total mess. We did not get that because the Census Bureau said they couldn't deliver. Then we have a new administration, and two of their first actions were to tell the Census Bureau, no, you are not producing counts of undocumented immigrants, which is almost impossible to do anyway by state. And you are not going to produce these citizen voting age population estimates for redistricting. So here we were. The Census Bureau processed the counts, and they did release them again 4 months late. Just came out, and we've seen a little bit of them. They're now working on the characteristics. And here they have issues like people will respond to the census, but they don't always fill in all the other items. So they have to do editing and imputation and so on. And they expect to have the redistricting data out again in mid to late August. Meanwhile, there is another lawsuit that Alabama has filed with 16 other states in support. And it is first saying, census, you're taking too long and we can't stand it for redistricting. This is not going to go anywhere because the Census Bureau cannot in good conscience just put out what it has now without the editing and so on it needs and review it needs to do. But the other thing Alabama is saying is Census Bureau, it's wanting the courts to tell the Census Bureau, you may not use this new differential privacy method because it is distorting the redistricting data too much. It's been tested with 2010 data so people can see what it's producing on 2010 compared with the actual 2010, which was also protected, but using a different and somewhat less extensive method. So this is going on. Okay, now, what do we know about the data and how good they are? Well, there's several ways to evaluate the quality of the census. One of them is called demographic analysis, or DA. You start with the previous census and you make some adjustments to that, and you add births, subtract deaths, and you add net international immigration. And you do this independently of the census. It's the different staff. Oh, you use Medicare enrollment too for the older population, which has been a great help. Now, they've released 3 series of DA estimates, high, medium, and low, because particularly with the international immigration component, there's uncertainty. The actual census count came in between the low and the middle, a little bit toward the low. If the low is true, or close to truth, then the census had a just very slight overcount. If the middle is closer to truth, then the census had a pretty slight undercount. In 2010, the census there was slightly over the middle. Now, demographic analysis gives us these kinds of estimates for age, single years of age, for some race, actually it's African-American and all other basically, and for gender, but not geography. And we don't have anything to compare yet until the redistricting data come out to see how the census matches up on some of the more detailed things. Anyway, that's one look. The second one is what I referred to when I said that mathematical statisticians have adapted wildlife biologist methods to trying to estimate the population through something called a post-enumeration survey. In the wildlife method, you want to estimate the number of fish in a lake. You capture a bunch of fish, you tag them, you throw them back in, you then do another capture, you see how many, what proportion had the tags. They won't all have the tags. And you use some algebra, and from that you can estimate pretty accurately actually the total population in the lake. Well, we can't tag people literally, but what we do is a separate staff draws a sample of neighborhoods. They do an independent address listing. And then after the census field work is done, they go out with the post-enumeration survey. And this was done over this last winter. And they have a very detailed questionnaire, and they really probe on who was here and who wasn't here as of Census Day, which is, of course, officially all the way back to April 1st. They then match that with the people who actually showed up in those neighborhoods in the census. They do some more field work to resolve cases that they're not certain of. And then they come up with an estimate of the total population and of who was missed in the census and who was double counted in the census. We won't have this until early 2022. And I'm worried that its quality may be iffy because the survey that was done last winter is also being done in the teeth of COVID. And people often will say, well, I responded to the census, don't bother me, and don't wait to hear the explanation that this is something different. What might it show? This is what 2010 showed. There were some groups that were slightly overcounted. People who are generally very conscientious. They might have 2 homes, for instance, and there might have been 2 responses there. It's whites, people who own their homes, women age 50 and over, people in update leave area. These are vacation areas. Think of the Delaware shore or the Maryland East, Atlantic shore, and the Midwest. Undercounted groups, minorities, American Indians on reservations, in particular, African Americans, Hispanics, renters, little kids tend to get missed, young men, and update enumeration is very, very backwoods. Think upper Maine or upper Minnesota or Michigan or something where they don't try for self-response. They send somebody out who's trying to find a cabin or a trailer here and one, a mile down the road or something, and doesn't always do it. What do we have now? We have something called operational process metrics, like how many people did self-respond and how many people did they have to go to a proxy, a neighbor, or a landlord. The American Statistical Association and my Committee on National Statistics at the National Academy of Sciences is right now getting into trying to evaluate those metrics. And we have some of them now. And self-response is what I'm going to focus on for the next couple of slides. That is key for quality. If you or someone in your household self-responded, whether that was internet, telephone, mail, whatever, you likely gave very accurate answers. You didn't leave people out. You didn't double count people. You didn't not answer some of the questions for people in your households. The final self-response rates based on the entire address list in 2020 were very similar to 2010, about 2/3 of the folks. But 2020 was more variable than 2010. And this is important, I think, for assessing its quality. These are census tracts, neighborhoods made up of collections of city blocks. The dark bars are 2010, and the light bars are 2020, and the bottom is percent self-response. You can see that the distribution is quite similar, but 2020 has what statisticians call fatter tails. There are more census tracts in the high response categories and more in the low response categories. And here is an analysis, in fact, of the 10% of census tracts that in 2020 had more than a 10% decline in their self-response from 2010. And this is by using some data from another survey, because we don't yet have these characteristics from the 2020 census to assess what's the majority in a neighborhood. And non-Hispanic white majority neighborhoods, Asian majority neighborhoods did better. They had a smaller percentage of tracts that had a decline in their response. African-American, Hispanic, immigrant majority, lower education, lower income, renter majority, all had a higher percentage of tracts that had a real fall off in their self-response from 2010 to 2020. Now, people went out to find folks, but that data is not as good quality as if they had self-responded. In addition to characteristics like minority, lower income, lower education, renter, which have been historically undercounted, I think internet broadband deserts, you might say, probably played a role this time in the variation here that's in census self-response. Okay, I'm not going to, I encourage you, I have references at the end of my slides and I've shared them with Capitol Hill Village. This is a website called ArcGIS, arcgis.com. And if you go there and type in something like 2020 census self-response rates, you'll get a bunch of neat interactive maps. What this is showing, this is counties in the US, and you can click, and look at the individual county and all that. The red triangles pointing down are where self-response declined from 2010 to 2020. The green triangles are where it increased. Here's the DC area, and you can kind of make out the Potomac River. And again, you have to go to the website to really make sense of this. Arlington's over to our left here on the screen, and it has a lot of increases in response. That's the turquoise. DC is a much more mixed bag. And again, I think internet access probably exacerbated the problems that have historically been there in terms of counting poor areas and so on. But go to this site and play around. It's actually quite a bit of fun. Okay, the last point I want to leave you with is what problems lie ahead still. All we have out are the 50 apportionment counts, and there will be the redistricting data and then other data products that come out that people use for fund allocation, planning, all kinds of things, you name it. So I'm putting redistricting on the table and this new privacy protection, and these are interlinked. The lateness of the redistricting data is putting states under considerable pressure. Some of them have off-year elections. Virginia does, for one, and they need to redistrict like yesterday. Some have actually moved dates that are in their own constitutions, knowing that the data are unavoidably late. A number of states now have nonpartisan or bipartisan redistricting commissions instead of the legislatures hammering it out. And the folks on those commissions have to be brought up to speed about what they're supposed to do and then work through it. And the data are late, and in some states, courts may take over. So I predict more chaos, likely more lawsuits than usual. There are always some lawsuits around redistricting. And this is related to this new privacy protection method. It infuses noise throughout the entire data set. And it is a useful technique in a number of situations. But for a multi-use, multi-dimensional data product that is used not by statisticians or economists or whatever, but by everybody from high school students to mayors to state legislatures, put it this way, the tests that have been done with 2010 data are not all that reassuring about the noise is making for some very odd situations. Again, as I said, Alabama is suing the Census Bureau to drop this method for redistricting. So the question is, the Census Bureau has to do something to prepare to protect privacy. It always has, and it needs to do that. So the big question is, do they have a plan B ready to go? Or are we going to have further delays if they lose this suit because they don't have a plan B? I personally hope they have a plan B. Say they win the suit, which they may. Courts don't often like to get into such a technical issue. Then I predict that once the redistricting data are out, there will be more lawsuits that happen to feature this in addition to all the other things that redistricting lawsuits always feature, and that the Census Bureau will be under the gun. And I truly think that would be very unfortunate for the Census Bureau and our system of, independent, objective. The Census Bureau is objective, but it's the perception. I really do worry about that. But here we are. Now, if you have decided that, okay, there's been some interesting stuff here, but my head is swimming and I really don't want to, it'll work out somehow, I fully understand. If you'd like to keep abreast of developments in the continuing 2020 storm, I highly recommend Hansi Lo Wang, who's a young reporter with NPR. He tweets, he blogs, he writes very objectively, very clearly, gets details right. And so if you go to his website, you can keep up to date with things and get a very good take. And you might want to invite me again, who knows, after the dust settles, particularly if these lawsuits, get out of hand. I do have a whole mess of references in my slides. And so including to the Census Bureau's website, where you can find the apportionment data, you can find these self-response metrics and other things. But anyway, I'm just delighted to have had this opportunity to talk with you. And I look forward to Q&A, discussion, thoughts, reflections on this process, which is built into our Constitution and our history and has generally served us very well to let us peaceably reallocate power. And again, we owe all credit to the Census Bureau dedicated public servants. Thank you.
Thank you from all of us, Connie. Virtual claps.
Let's see, I'll stop screen sharing.
That would be good.
Yeah.
We have a number of questions in the chat, but first I'm going to ask one myself.
Sure.
There was a great article that was published last June in the Journal of American History on the history of the census. And you told me you'd read it and you thought it was good. One of the things that struck me was a chart on the cost per household that the census requires. And from 1950, and by the way, the 1950 census will be released next year, because by statute, it is closed for 72 years. So raw data from 1950 will be released by the National Archives in 2022. But in 1950, I'm looking at it, and it was about, $18 a household.
Yep.
And in 2010, it was over 100.
Yep.
What's going on? What's causing the census expense?
That is a very good question. The basic answer is that, and again, these are figures, I've seen them many times, adjusted for inflation, and they are per household, but we have gotten more diverse and complex, and we have also had a big push starting in the 60s civil rights era to beef up the accuracy of the census. We know that, for instance, the 1940 census counted fewer young men of draft age than showed up for the draft. The 1950 census had a net undercount of, it was something like 4 or 5%. It was really large for African Americans, young men in particular. And there was a big push, a lot of lawsuits, a lot of trying to work out methods to adjust the census after the fact to correct for this undercount. Those turned out not to be feasible at scale, but the Census Bureau invested in a lot of efforts to get out the count, improve the count, special operations. In 2000, for the first time, they used to rely on public service advertising from the Advertising Council. But when the fairness doctrine and other things went away, those announcements, broadcasters could show them like at 3 a.m. or something. So in 2000, probably a decade late, but in 2000, the Census Bureau paid for advertising, and they have continued to do that. And it's actually been, I think, quite effective, but of course it costs money. They have partnership staff that they send out to work with individual cities and states. They have, again, programs to count people in very odd situations, everything from circus performers to, again, people in homeless shelters or sheltered in like underpasses and so on that communities tell them about. So, and also, again, we reached a bottom of the percent of the foreign-born population following that 1924 Restrictive Immigration Act in 1970, roughly, and then we've been going up. So we have huge language diversity now. And so the internet questionnaire, the mail questionnaire, the telephone interviewers, they offered, I don't know how many languages and translation services and all that. Basically, the 50 census was the last one that essentially housewives conducted. And everybody, it was all door to door. They gradually shifted to more and more of it being self-response, first by the mail and then now by the internet. And while they actually saved some money initially with that, they also improved quality because, again, self-response, no matter how good the interviewer is, self-response, it tends to be the best quality. But all these operations, advertising and partnership staff and translation and special operations in vacation areas, more and more vacation homes. People didn't have two homes, it's just gotten incredibly complex. And that has added costs. I don't know yet. I don't think I've seen figures on this census, but it's somewhere in the ballpark of what 2010 was. We have worked a lot at the Academy on efforts to try to work with them to streamline things. And this time, in addition to the internet, they actually used smartphones for the interviewers, and they had routing software, like UPS does, to tell you go to this address and that address, and that did help them. But we are just a very diverse, complex population. And also, the other factor is that self-response has dropped. The census does very well, and they've managed to stabilize it by spending a lot more money, like all those repeat letters and postcards and all that stuff, all those reminders, because worldwide, I remember in the 40s and 50s and 60s, people loved getting surveys on the phone. You felt important, this was unusual. Well, now, everybody turns it off. And the census, of course, gets huge publicity, and it has this very important constitutional purpose, but there's a lot of people who aren't paying attention. So all those factors entered into the cost equation.
Thank you. Joel Sarfati asks a question. Joel, do you want to do it yourself? If so, unmute.
Will unmute and turn on my video. How's that?
Hello.
The District of Columbia, first of all, an excellent presentation, really
Thank you.
fantastic. So
Thank you.
obviously the District of Columbia is somewhat different from all others in
Yes.
terms of reapportionments. So I imagine the census impacts the wards. What is it, based on population?
Yes.
And change in geography similar to what
Yes.
takes place? Do we have a gerrymandering problem to be anticipated?
I don't know. I hope not. We, we don't have, I don't think we have the partisan aspect because the city is so heavily Democratic that it's not possible to really with however, 8 wards to, pack one party into, it just doesn't work the way it does in bigger states. But the other big thing besides political parties is, of course, the race ethnicity distribution of the population and trying to keep neighborhoods together that are viewed as, sort of contiguous and sharing, things and so on. I don't actually, I wasn't paying attention, I guess, the last time around with redistricting. Maybe there is somebody on this call who knows about that, but they will use the census data, yes, to redo the wards.
Mhm.
And with 600 and what was it, 89,000 or something and 8 wards, that's a sizable number to work with. Not, I mean, it's the size of one congressional district these days, but if we were a state, we'd have one district and 2 senators. That's how that would go. We are actually now bigger in population than I think it's Vermont and Wyoming that each, have their 2 senators and 1 district.
Tricia Thompson, you've got a question. Do you wish to do it yourself or do you wish me to read it?
Yeah, I'll unmute myself. Thanks, Trudy. And Constance, let me reiterate Joel's compliment. Really interesting presentation, and I'm amazed at the depth of your knowledge. I had 2 questions actually. One is, when do you think the online tool will be available for us laymen to use? We've been playing around with that on the advocacy team, and so how long after the stuff becomes public is that available?
Oh, you mean for redistricting?
The tool you can get on the Census Bureau, you can get online, and then you can open up the census data and you can search by wards and by age. And
oh, to get actual data and statistics?
yes.
Yeah. Well, right now, of course, you can look up the 50 state numbers, but that's not of great interest. As soon as the redistricting data are out, now, because of the pressure for timelines, they're actually going to try to put out by mid-August a less user-friendly version, what they call their legacy version that redistrictors have experience using. Then by September, they expect to put out a more user-friendly tool that for redistricting that people can fiddle around with and a much more intuitively. On data.census.gov, I think that's the site now where you get census data. They should have that redistricting data up at the same time frame, I would think, September. That's just so. And then the other products, there's the next one they're calling demographic and housing characteristics. We used to call it summary file 1 in the old days. And it will have, redistricting has just voting age population over and under. Actually, it doesn't have gender. I was forgetting that. And it has race, ethnicity, Hispanic crossed with the race categories. And that's it, basically. And the group quarters population, because some states take prisoners and put them in their home place for redistricting and not where some contract prison that they have, say a city has out in some rural area. But that's really all that's on redistricting. The next file, demographic and housing characteristics, will have full age, sex, family composition, household composition, number of kids and all that. When that'll come out, I do not know, because they put all of that aside while they're trying to get the basic constitutional data out. Plus, they have this privacy protection thing, and that's going to be even more difficult if they persist in using this method to work out for this demographic and housing characteristics. But you should be able, by ward and block and census tract and so on, to get the redistricting data in September, and that does have some basics in it that should be useful to you.
Thanks very much for that. And the second question was actually, it's a good segue from your last remarks. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this DP methods that you talked
Yes.
about and what they use and why they're controversial?
Okay, what they used to do is they would look for essentially neighborhoods. For instance, take the one Hispanic or African-American family in a neighborhood, and they would use, they used to, in the old days, just not give you the race distribution for that area, which of course data users didn't like. Then they started using something called data swapping, where they would identify these folks who would sort of stick out and be easy to re-identify by, you know, matching with all the data that's out on the internet there. And they would look for the same size household, same number of adults and kids, but essentially switch them. And they didn't do this very extensively, but they did it enough. But they preserved the population of any neighborhood, any city block, any town, any village didn't change because of this. The differential, they then did some studies following 2010 where they say it's much easier to re-identify people from the tables that are put out. You know, you take, again, commercial data. Now, there are some questions that people have about those studies, but there's no doubt that privacy is more threatened these days than ever before. Differential privacy comes out of the computer science world. It's had application in health data. Google, Facebook, et cetera, they use it to try to uphold their pledge of protecting our data, although I don't know how well they do that, but anyway. But it uses a mathematical algorithm and it perturbs the tables slightly, all of the tables. And except for the 50 state populations, which will not be changed in any data product, any other place, town, neighborhood can have a slightly different population than what it actually had in the census. And that protects, yes, but it is also given some weird results like housing, like city blocks that have more, let's see, what's a good example? That don't have any occupied housing, but have people in them purportedly after this noise has been added. In the test results, age distributions like school children moving up are ragged rather than what you'd like as population ages and all that. And they have been fine-tuning it, and they will probably have a redistricting product that is pretty decent on this. I think they will have a terrible time with demographic and housing characteristics because there's all this additional data, but they are right now on a kind of a almost, well, anyway, it is unfortunate. This is the first major data set that has political implications and is used by almost everybody in the country to have this method applied. Otherwise, it's been used and quite successfully for research data products, where the users of those products know how to work with the data. Oh, and also just to tell you what happens with this, we have 19,540 incorporated places spread around the US. Towns, villages, cities. They range from New York City and, Atlanta and LA and so on, down to villages and towns that are, fewer than 1,000 people, fewer than 500 people. And there are a lot of these small ones. And so their numbers are getting, again, sort of, a little noisier than you would like, particularly because for very small areas and for like race ethnicity populations in those areas, the algorithm can give you a negative number. you know, it's very, you know, and you can't hand out negative numbers to the mayors of the country and tell them, oh, go apply a statistical confidence interval and your estimate's somewhere here. You know, you just can't do it. So they have a step after they've run this algorithm that they call post-processing to try to fix that up. And they fix that up, but then that distorts a little something somewhere else. Again, whole seminars, reams of paper among those of us who are trying to follow this, discussions have been devoted to this. And it's very hard, even for very knowledgeable people, to understand quite what's going on, except it is protecting, that is true, but it is introducing noise that to many users appears unacceptable. Now, census will say that privacy, you know, is very important, which it is, but they are also trying to protect against extreme circumstances, like the Russians trying to take all the tables and figure out who everybody is. And users are saying, this is not really that plausible. And actually, the data in the census, generally, with some exceptions, they're not asking income, they're not asking education, they're not asking a whole lot of things, are not all that, you know, sensitive, and they do need protection, yes. But whether it should be this method, which again affects the entire data set rather than outliers as they used to do, you know, people who were sort of unique in their block or their neighborhood. So there is, again, this is in court, and the reading all the affidavits on each side and the amicus briefs, if you, is really quite fascinating. Email trails, you know, I mean, it's kind of a big deal. Yeah. So.
Well, we have come to the end of our hour. Thank you again, Connie, for a wonderful presentation. We certainly will be inviting you back when we learn a little bit more about the outcome of the census. And to everyone, remember to join us next month. It will be on a Tuesday instead of a Monday. It will be Tuesday, June 8, and we will be talking with Christian Osterman, who is writing a book on Marcus Wolf, the East German spy chief, the last one, and he'll be talking about spying between the US and the old East Germany. So do join us then. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you all. And again, I can send my slides to everybody, or maybe you put those up, I don't know, but, and send me questions offline. I'm Citro, CCITRO @nas.edu. And I'm obviously a census geek and happy to talk. So thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.